Welcome to the Mount Gretna School of Art lecture series hosted here in the Pennsylvania Chautauqua's Hall of Philosophy. It's always an honor to be in this building with our artist lectures and a part of the Chautauqua tradition here in Mount Gretna, Pennsylvania. I also want to thank Stinson Strout for his support of our lecture series this summer. Big help to our bottom line and paying all the artists to come through our community. It's a rich cultural resource that we wouldn't have otherwise. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank some of our sponsors. One of our corporate sponsors, Purpose One. And I'd also like to thank the Mount Gretna Arts Council, the Rodney G. DeHaven Fund, William Drindle Fund of the Mount Gretna United Methodist Church, the Thomas A. and Georgina T. Rousseau Family Foundation, the Rosemary Beck Foundation. I love saying that. She was one of my favorite painters in college, so it's always an honor. I'm going to move over to introducing Bruce, who I'm very happy is here. When we first moved to Pennsylvania and didn't know anybody in 2006, he reached out and put Heidi and I involved us in some art shows, and I know he's been following the school and its activities for many years. So I'm really happy that he was able to become part of this summer as one of our lead drawing instructors. And he comes down from Camden, where he teaches at Rutgers. And you did have a show recently in Stockton before the pandemic. Stockton University that I thought I would mention. If you might be able to find something about that online. And I'm going to let him take it from here.
First of all, I want to say thanks for coming. And I just want to take a second to thank Jay and Heidi for having me up here this summer. It's been great. And he's right. I have sort of, every year I try to pitch in a little cash for this place because I think it's a great thing. A little bit more about me. I graduated from the University of Delaware in 1984, so I've been around for a while. I kicked around as an illustrator for about 9 years until I started to teach for a living. From there on, I was basically a painter full time. I always painted even when I was an illustrator. But anyway, I'm going to talk about working space today, which actually, I read a book by Frank Stella. I think I read it in 1986 or 87, something like that. Stella's book was a book about the change from the idea of flatness and abstraction. And he thought that abstraction, in order to grow, needed to look at the space from essentially the Renaissance and more particularly the Baroque. But what it mostly did is it made me think about the idea of working space. And so I was thinking of working space as more of almost a metaphorical kind of working space. What do I allow around myself and into my work as a kind of a space? So I thought today we'd talk about it in terms of those things that are either allowed or welcomed into your work, and also those things that you keep out, those things that you specifically don't want to pursue. Okay? So some of those things are sources of imagery. You work from direct observation, you work from memory, invention, inspiration from other art. How about the medium? Is it pure, or do you mix mediums, things like that? Do you work with ideas or concepts, theories? And then maybe a little bit about means and ends and the difference between means and ends. So the other thing, actually there's 3 different kinds of working space. Right? The other is working space is just literally the space of the painting, right? So depicted illusionary or real space in a work, and also its relationship to the viewer, which I think is very important. And then the last is actually working space as literally where you work. Where do you make paintings? Where do you think about paintings? Okay, so the literal sort of noun of your working space. Where do you make your work? I found that I've worked in a lot of different spaces, a fair number of different spaces, I'll put it that way. And I'm not going to go back and show you all of them over time, but this is when I moved to where I live now, which I lived there for about 30 years at this point. So this is it. And I actually paint on that upper floor. You see that little window up there? Well, that's the only window in the space. Oh, this is another picture of a painting outside. Occasionally I would paint outside. The thing about this carriage barn is it's whatever the weather is outside, that's what it is more or less inside. So if it's really cold, it's really cold. If it's really hot, it's even hot. So that's the downside of the carriage barn studio. But anyway, this is what the light is like inside of that studio. And in some ways, although I had kind of been making things that had sort of a Baroque kind of lighting to them, this particular studio, if I worked only by the natural light that came in, had that sort of directional, focused, natural daylight that became a big part of the work that I made for probably 10, 12 years, I would say. An old portrait of my wife there, right-hand side. So that was the main space I worked in for like 10 years. Then I got to the point where I was teaching at Rutgers like 4 days a week. So I was at school all the time. So I actually started painting at Rutgers because there was one room, which I'll show you in a second, which was small and was available kind of all the time. So I would work in there. And then this is actually in the summertime. This is probably 2010, I'm thinking. It's just, this is the large drawing studio. The large drawing studio and a large painting studio, both of which are about the same size. So the paintings became even bigger, for one thing. And also, it's just a bank of north light. So it's this almost uncontrollable amount of light. And then the other studio is out in the landscape. So this is me. Actually, this was we used to take students up to the Poconos for a week at a time, sort of like this, but like a week. And this is me sitting on the bank of one of the places we go to most often, which was actually a place that I knew because we used to go vacation there. This is actually New Jersey. The other was the other side of the water gap in Pennsylvania. Anyway, and this is that middle room. All right, so it's a smaller room, but it also had my comfortable chair in it. So this is where I would go to look at things most often. And also, I actually painted quite a lot. So a lot of these, like these still life things, I would actually set up in one of the big studios, but then I would paint them away from the things themselves. I would often draw them in the same room, but go away to paint them. Like here's an example. This is this big red paint, which I think you'll see the whole paint later. But that's kind of a setup from one of these things. And then usually I draw from it. Maybe I paint a little bit from it, but mostly I draw from it. And then go back and paint later. And here's that middle room again. This is some later landscape. One of the things that's interesting about this is actually done from drawings. Most of the time, when I'm in the landscape, I tend to draw more so than paint. Lazy in terms of that. I don't always like to drag all the stuff. Some of these places are kind of remote or hard to get to, so dragging a lot of stuff is inconvenient. I just occasionally I'll paint. There's a painting here that I just paint on the site. And then the last place I wanted to show you is this is actually my dining room at home, where mostly it's stacks of books, and I drag my work down and stare at it, which is a big part of my practice, is staring at my work and other people's work. And this is kind of a recent photograph. I wanted to, I stuck this in because there's actually several eras. There's like 20 years worth of work sort of represented here. And I thought that was interesting. That the one on the far right is probably, well, the one on the far right here is the oldest thing. And then The small waterfall is kind of in the middle of that, and done from on the spot. And then these other two are relatively recent, like in the last 3 years. The big yellow one, very recent, and kind of an experiment where I all of that sort of foliage down at the bottom is actually made up of monotypes made by putting paint on leaves and things and running them through the press. And then, so it was an experimental thing that I'm thinking I might do some more of, but I haven't yet. Okay, so that's kind of some ideas about space, your actual working space. What do you do? Where is it at? How does it affect your work? Where they work affects their work somehow or other. I'm sorry, the next thing I want to talk about is working space in terms of what it is you allow into your work. What do you want your work to be about? Is it narrow? Is it broad? I always think of myself as like being a fairly maximal kind of painter. I try to get as much in as I think I can while it still holds together, is recognizable with my work, so I don't. So there's sources of imagery. I mean, like when I paint, there's almost always an aspect of direct observation. Well, actually, there's always an aspect of direct observation, because something I tell students all the time is that the most important thing you observe is actually the painting you're working on, right? In the end, that's all anybody else ever sees, right? So looking at that is a big part of anybody who's a painting practice. But also looking at subject matter, memory, and memory is one of those things where I work from memory quite a lot. Part of that came from some of the people that I looked at. And then the medium, how pure or impure. I just mentioned, usually I only work like in oil paint. Sometimes I'll underpaint acrylic, but what you see in the end is oil paint. Recently, I've been putting different sorts of things in. I was doing, like I say, some of this collage prints. So it becomes a bit more of a hybrid thing. And then what kind of ideas and concepts, theories you work out? How do you separate the means from ends? I mean, oftentimes, a lot of students sometimes get lost in means and forget about the ends. Being able to do such and such a thing, that's all there is to it. Just purely the practice becomes the end in itself. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few people who influenced my work here, and this is very much the short list, because I'm actually influenced one way or another by almost everybody's work that I see. Right? You either like it, you don't like it, or sometimes it's like whatever. And that's the work that doesn't really influence. I mean, oftentimes I'm influenced. I do something in my work based on something I see that I really dislike for whatever reason. But this is probably where my work goes back to. There's probably very little that I do that he didn't do. So Cezanne is kind of almost at the base of my work. And I think that because a large part of what he did had to do with observation, with working from the motif. A large part of what he did had to do with that thing that became new in painting with the Impressionists in him, which is that you're oftentimes putting paint on without it literally being paint, right? It's just a mark. And you get enough marks and it adds up to something. It's not really how things were done for the most part before the Impressionists. And the other thing that I like about him, I'm very influenced by his Bader's paintings, which are those paintings that essentially he just made up, right? They kind of look like they might have been somewhere, but if you really look at them, you realize, no, there was this group of people was never all standing naked in the woods anymore. It's all it's all about art, and it comes out of really. I think that's his desire to be on a level with the old masters, right? When you look at Titian, people like that. And like, you know, I'm like that too. Bonar, and anybody who's interested in color at some point comes to Bonar. And he's one of my great loves. So, Matisse. Matisse has become more and more important for me in a lot of ways. And I've actually done a fair number of sort of interpretations of his work, this being actually one of them. Braque is somebody that I'm very interested in, and I'm actually working on a painting now that's sort of very specifically about Braque. Marsden Hartley, he was one of my favorite American painters. Diebenkorn, who is probably my favorite abstract expressionist, I suppose. And of course, he also worked representationally. But I always loved this. This is one of the later Berkeley paintings. And what I liked about this was that I could see in this a figure, reclining figure here, laying on a pedestal with a bunch of stuff on the floor. Do you guys see that? Maybe it's just me. But that's what I saw. And, you know, aside from it being a great painting, right? This is Edwin Dickinson. Some of these guys are people that I saw great exhibitions by early on when I was beginning to learn how to paint. And you know, when I first came to painting, I didn't know what painting was at all. I mean, my idea of painting was more of a novel. But when I saw a show of Edwin Dickinson's premier coup paintings in Washington, like it was 81 or so. It was one of the first shows I saw. And I was just, oh, that's what this is. And it was a life-changing thing. And this is a guy I went to school with, Martin Green. And this is one of the paintings he was actually painting when we were together. He was actually in graduate school, and he came in as a graduate the second year I was there, I guess 81. And he, in like the second semester, so he started painting these big paintings. And this is like an 8-foot square painting. It barely fit in his studio. He had to set double doors. It would only fit in the studio. It went from one side of the studio to the other. What I like about this, what I take from this, I mean, he was, if anybody's a bigger Dickinson fan than I am, he's in. But, you know, it's very kind of put together, which Dickinson would do as well. If you look at, not so much his Premier Coups, but he did these big sort of machine paintings that were all done from observation, but it was a piece at a time. I mean, that trailer with the drapery over it, well, he went out and did that. It was a trailer that sat out back of our main building where a couple of printmakers had their studios. The green thing in the foreground with the chair, and that's just in the studio, it's like a set of dividers or something. And this chair was the chair around the studio that everybody coveted and we all stole. I think we all painted it at one time or another as well. But he actually painted, that's exactly what it looked like. But anyway, Mark's a great painter. And this is a work by each of my undergraduate professors who, in one way or another, sort of affected my work. Larry Holmes, when I first went there, he was doing sort of pattern paintings on three-dimensional canvases, which were really interesting. And then at some point about midway through, he started doing these paintings that began with alligators. This isn't the first one I saw, but it was the first one I could find online, where they were in these invented or real spaces, but he was like putting it together. So the idea that he's taking various elements and putting them together in a painting that then, you know, you believe that there's this, you know, marble terrace going out onto the Everglades kind of thing. Steve Tannis, the one in the middle, not long before he started to become a realist painter, which is what he's really known for and has been doing certainly since the late 70s. I started out as a color field painter. So I actually sort of painted that way when I was in undergraduate school. My first paintings were sort of color field paintings. But this is, once again, part of this, it has to do with scale. Steve paints at a scale that I would say is roughly life size at the picture plane, which I pretty much adopted for the most part in my work, other than small landscapes. And then the last painter is Robert Bob Straight, who's probably one of the most inventive painters that I can imagine. He's like prolific, and he just reinvents himself. So in some ways, it's just like the trajectory of their work in some ways affects me. And it affects me to this day. I mean, I'm still friends with all these guys. You see work every once in a while. Anyway, important. So this is the first work of mine that, it's not some other picture that I want to show you. And I'm showing it to you because I painted this around the time I went back to graduate school, which was 1998. I went to graduate school late after I actually went to graduate school because I had started to teach and I had never gotten my own. So I went back to school, and this was one of the first things that I started to paint. And the original was very much came out of some straight realistic paintings that I did. They were completely done from observation. The stuff was set up in the room, and then I painted them. And in this case, the little glass of flowers was done that way. But then I started adding these elements that had to do with putting this into the landscape. So I'm right out of Larry Holmes' work in some ways. But I'm also playing around with odd scales. The landscape is essentially invented. There's a tree over here on the right. It's a little hard to see. It's actually more or less scratched into the wet paint. And it was really, I think I got that from some other artist's etching. I sort of copied it out of that, right? And I drew it in like it was sort of etched into it. And then up on the left there, those are actually some leaves that I put them into paint on my palette and then pressed them onto paints and then painted into that to some degree. In the background, the real far distance is just real pure generalization. There's already this mix of various things. So this was done a little later, but at a similar time. And this is one of those places. In fact, the painting that I brought today is actually the same waterfall. So I painted the still life in the foreground from the actual objects. Well, actually, that's not true. The flowers themselves were in a different kind of vase, and then I painted the other vases, like made it look like they were in. And then the little doily thing down in the foreground, those are like little sugar cookies, or those Danish sugar cookies that you get at Christmas time. The other thing that I got is you get these weird senses of scale and space. They're kind of realistic, and then if you really look at them, you go, there's something wonky about that space. Right? Like sometimes there's this branch and these weird branches hanging down. This is actually that painting that was outside the barn. I actually recently destroyed this, but this gets into that kind of space and those ideas of Edwin Dickinson's big machine paintings. I mean, the landscape itself is all real places, but it's a couple of different real places, and it was done from drawings. The figures were done from drawings from just a regular life drawing class. I was teaching life drawing in Delaware at the time. Some of the drapery I did at the same time that I was drawing the figures, but the one hanging down from the top, I think I actually nicked that out of a Dürer print. So, but I just painted it rather than it being, I think it was a Frohlich cut or something. So the stuff comes from all over this. So this, I'm showing you this because sometimes I'm affected by my own old work. This is a watercolor that I did when I was in undergraduate school. It was the first body of work that I felt really kind of good about, and I showed it different places. It was popular. People bought some of them. So it was sort of like my big first. I don't know. After I did these, I felt like, oh, I'm not just a student. I'm actually an artist. So that was probably 83, I would say. Anyway, these were these big sort of setups of essentially my. This is just sort of my painting table. I added some extra junk to it, but so it would be more interesting and a little more cluttered. But this essentially was my painting table. The book that's sitting out with the figure on it, that's actually was a kind of a how-to watercolor book by Charles Reed, who was really an interesting painter at the time, and sort of encompassed some of. I thought he was a really good version of put together of like Fairfield Porter and Richard Devenport. So anyway, I learned how to paint watercolor reading his books. So anyway, this is watercolor. It's like 30 by 40, so it's a fairly large watercolor. So I had started back then. I tried to do them in oil, and they were just disasters. They were horrible. I don't know why, but they were pretty horrible. So I never did them. But when I came back and started painting in the at Rutgers again all the time, I was sort of in that same kind of place. Because one of the things that I had when I put all my work out was one of those days. Those days are about yay high. So that's what this is, and a lot of it comes out of that. And this painting is roughly 5 by 6 feet. So there's that scale again, where everything is sort of life size and picture. And what changed here, I think, I suppose I should talk about this. What's kind of changed from the other paintings, which there's a whole group of work that sort of painted like those first paintings I saw. Started to paint in more separated patches of color, rather than which I sort of painted that way before, but I did it with big 2-inch, 4-inch brushes, and then you would work into those patches of paint. More like Edwin Dickinson would work, or actually Scott Noel paints that. Whereas these are done to a large degree with a palette. So it's much more mixing colors on the palette and putting them on. I'm also leaving a lot of color really saturated. So the color saturation becomes greater in the overall painting. And the other ones had areas of really saturated color, but it tended to be there was more neutral areas that sort of were the favorite day. I mean, part of what I was interested in those first is that idea of this white ground that it comes on. And I'm pretty sure that that goes back to Bonnard. So, you get these sort of colored cast shadows and whatnot. There was also, as I was doing these, this is actually a small painting, much larger. It's probably this is like 24 inches square. So still, the objects are roughly life size, but this is smaller. There's less objects. I was leaving more of the canvas bare. So some of the white that you see is bare canvas, some is painted. You can see there that dark area. That's just where the edge of the table was, where you see the floor is dark, but I didn't paint it all dark. So areas that are left unfinished or undone, as opposed. I think it was undone as opposed to. So the next thing I want to show you is I started to do. To think about some paintings that I really liked. My work started to be about the studio. Because I was spending so much time in the studio teaching, the advice is always paint what you know. Well, I know the studio, I know models coming in, this and that studio life. So I always love this painting by Matisse. And this is actually sort of it's not a very good color reproduction of it. The colors are inaccurate. But I'm actually sort of interested in reproductions that are inaccurate. I mean, I like the ones that are actually like the painting. But it's interesting to see sort of, I mean, if you go online and look up some paintings, put in the image, it's like, you think that's the same painting and there's like 50 different versions of it. But anyway, I started to paint this, which is, I think this is like 8 feet tall and probably about 6 feet wide. And what I did, it was not really an attempt to make a copy of the painting. What I did is I sort of recreated some of the stuff in the painting, right? So, I got a divider, I got a piece of fabric, that sort of thing. I had a stool with some sort of ceramic thing on it. There's a statue over there. So I set this up in the studio. There was actually a small carpet there that I modified more like, the divider. That's an actual thing, as is the drapery hanging over it, and the two draperies hanging over it. The pattern on it is fake, and I just made that up. The figure came from figure drawing class. The Marshall in the background, that's memory. I used to have a nice 50-watt stack that I got rid of one time. And the guitar was mine. But the statue is actually a George Stevens, which I don't know. And then in the foreground, there's also a book that has another Matisse painting in it that I had done a reproduction from. So things sort of start to move from painting to painting. This is just it as I was working on some of the other paintings I was working on. That's my comfy chair that I sit and stare at them for long periods. This was another painting that came out of that. It was just another pose by the same model. I tried to put it in sort of a similar space. I worked on this. I call it a study for the Pig Studio, but it's kind of. I was actually working on it at the same time. This is another big still life. This is like 60 by 72. There's actually a couple of different things, like the space, the stuff in the foreground on the right was one sort of still life, and then the one in the back, that was another still life, and then the one with the figure, that was another kind of still life that I kind of pushed together, and stuff overlaps and gets painted through, and then at the end, once it's all in the painting, you begin to paint the painting like it's all really there. So, some of these things tend to have things that are just of interest to me. I was reading little books about how you make models and those sorts of things. What I loved about those things was really sort of how they were painted. I was never that big into making the model. I always wanted to paint the model. That kind of pattern, camouflage and stuff. The book in the foreground was a book that I had outlined about photography or filmmaking. When I was in undergraduate school, I made some strange art films. This is the painting I did after Blue Nude from Baltimore. Here I actually used a model, but in the end, because I can't afford to pay a model to be there the whole time, probably. I usually do it from drawings, and then here I actually I had a little old reproduction of it that I put in the painting too. The plants in the background, I think they just came from some online, source. But everything in the foreground was essentially in the studio. That was the studio setup. But you can kind of see it, and I had a mannequin that I used to sort of replace where the model was as a space holder. And one of the things that had changed in these new works, which is pretty apparent in this in the painting here, is the amount of drawing, like that pattern. Like I would literally draw it, very specifically, and then sometimes it would get completely painted, but sometimes I would just leave it as a drawing. That's the painting in the Baltimore Museum, along with the sculpture that he had actually painted. Apparently, the way that the weird anatomy in that painting had to do with the fact that he was painting it from this statue, but it was, I actually tried to mimic that some of that bad anatomy, where the anatomy is wrong. Like these legs, that leg's actually going back there. It's sort of multiple figures. Like here, there's another arm, which is how I really did it. I actually drew from a couple of different poses in the model. They were both in there, and then they sort of morphed into one in the end. This is just another still life. You can kind of see the dais there. You know, this one, like this is the drawing for the pink nude. You know, sometimes things get moved around and they stay in these. Like this was actually this book, just I had it placed differently. So when I was painting it, I actually still like that drawing, so I left it. So here's that red studio that we started. Right? This is in progress and not terribly good slides, over a lot of photos. But it gives you an idea of you know, how what the stuff looks like when I'm looking at it. And like I said, I mostly draw from. To a large degree, I painted this in that middle room, although occasionally I would drag it back out to kind of compare it to see whether I'm really off track. And to a certain degree, I don't really care, but you know, whether it's off track or not, as long as I like what's going on in the painting. But to a certain degree, I put all this red, which you don't see here, but this is really like a red sheet. And here again, this is made up of like several different spaces. Like this stuff down here is this space that's a set of steps that the model you get up on the dais. You know, and then here's the dais. Then this space back here is, in some ways, it was the dais again, because this and the chair were sitting on it. So, you know, the scale of this is really wrong for where it is. And then there's this this easel up here that actually came from a whole weird solarized photograph or something. And this figure, which oftentimes people don't even see, is a figure that I borrowed out of about the green painting that I've always loved. Here's the actual painting. I've shown this several times, so it's kind of done. But one of the things that I often do is, if it doesn't go somewhere else, if it's not, you know, unless it's in somebody else's hands and not mine, it's always fair game to work on it again. And I actually do that fairly often. Here's just a couple of details on it. This shows up in a lot of things. This is like a smaller painting. Once again, it's roughly life size. You know, it's like 18 by 24 or something. I put this in because I was starting to think about putting patterns into things a lot more. Here's sort of an aerial view. These are two separate paintings, but they're the same, more or less the same still life that was rearranged slightly. And I got to where I show them together because I like the slight disconnect between the spaces. I mean, they were just done from slightly different perspectives when I drew. And well, it's almost like a continuation too. It's not exactly a continuation, but you can see like the coffee can sort of continues. I drew Giacometti in here because another sort of big influence, partially because of his interest in how so much of his work was really about that little cavern studio of his. And also his interest in painting figures and specifically sort of portraits that in some way are really about his looking at the model more so than they are about, you know, resemblance to the model. I mean, oftentimes you can't really tell the difference in the paintings about who's who. So these are just a few figure drawings. Over the years, especially since about 97 or so, I've done a lot of figure drawing, sort of off and on, depending on whether I was teaching it most of the time. But I sort of do newsprint pads and drawing pads like for sketchbooks. I generally draw 18 by 24 size is the size I'm comfortable with. But anyway, these are just a few that have just sort of different kinds of ideas about how to draw. I mean, I think about how to draw, and I don't feel like I have a style that I have to adhere to. I talked about this with the figure drawing class the other day. So, oftentimes drawings are about setting up a set of parameters within which you work for that drawing. Maybe there's lots of drawings that are like that, but like the one on the left is sort of very sort of Giacometti oriented, looking at planes and sort of the way that the head is built around this globe of the skull kind of thing. The one in the middle was really more about, it was done almost like a blind contour drawing, mostly looking at the model and tracing around the edges of it, but not quite. And then the third one there, what's interesting about that is it was actually, I had a model who tended to fall asleep. So she was there and she was fine. So I was drawing her, and then she fell asleep. And she fell back, like she had like one eye open and one eye closed. And so there's both of those things are in the same drawing. I really like that drawing. It's a weird drawing, but I really like it. And this is just, oftentimes I'll pose a model so that the studio becomes part of it. It's about space. It's not always just about drawing a figure that's sort of floating around in space, but they're in a space and in some sort of a context. I mean, there's always sort of that, there's, whenever you're dealing with especially the nude, it's like, well, what kind of context are there? There's only certain situations where, we as a culture are running around naked, right? It's like when we get a shower or make love or in a figure drawing class. So sometimes by putting that context in, it's really just talking about this is why. It's not really a justification for why we draw a figure, but really just it's context. These are just a few paintings that are sort of similar. I would say that they were drawn out of this sort of idea on the left there. On the left was an important painting for me. I actually did it one night. I was teaching a painting class, and they were all working away, and I was sort of bored at the time, actually, because they didn't really need my help that much. So I actually painted a painting while they were doing it, and I did it. This is the first sort of painting that's sort of patchy, chunks of paint coming out of that earlier work. So it was an important kind of painting. The one on the right began more or less like the last two you saw, and then I started to think, that reminds me of this figure in a bronze painting of an artist painting a model. And I put this sort of hinted at this sort of profile inside of full face, which is kind of subtle here, but this is definitely thinking about John. And during this period, a lot of paintings were starting to get very colorful, but there's always, or most of the time, a fair amount of brown and gray too. And sometimes I sort of think in those kinds of terms. To some degree, these are put into quasi sort of natural settings in the background, although they're very amorphous and vague. The idea was that it would feel like they were maybe outdoors, because I was thinking about doing beige paintings to do this, and just so you can see what the sort of paint surface is like. As I'm painting these, there's a fairly broad range of how the paint is both put on and sort of viscosities, how thick, how thin, and then it goes from being very sort of washy, so there in the upper left-hand corner, being fairly thick. And on occasion, they've gotten really thick, but I'm not always happy with it. I'm not interested in painting thick just for the sake of painting thick. I mean, for me, it has to do something. Usually thick paint means closer to more than anything else. Or where I want you to look, we tend to look at thick paint before we look at thin paint. So here's one of the 3 great beta paintings. This is the one that's in the Philadelphia Museum. And once again, this is not a great reproduction of it, but the color is very kind of pulled up, the chrome is pulled up, the contrast is increased here. And, we happen to be, or I happen to live near Philadelphia, so I get to see at least 2 of them fairly often, because the second one, the first one he started to do was is in the Barnes Foundation. Unfortunately, they rarely take it down to where you're seeing it really at the proper height to look at it, but it is there. And then the third one is in London, and and that one was actually here a couple of times in the relatively recent past. It was in Cezanne and Bayonne at the Philadelphia. So at one time, all 3 when that show was up, all 3 of the great painters. It was a real treat. I never used to do it. But anyway, this is the one I look at the most. And it's the latest one, and arguably the one that it's sort of, I like it, I think, because it relates a lot to his watercolors. My guess is had he lived, he only worked on this for about 7 or 8 months. He started in early 1906 is what they say, and he died in October. So my guess is that had he had his way, this one would have become much more like the other 2 in the end, because he had started to paint a lot more paint. So this is the version of it that I've done. And the interesting thing about this is, if you remember that first picture of me back sitting in my studio at the very beginning with the title, about 20 years ago, that photograph was taken. This painting was sitting behind me, and it had sat like that for, I think I repainted it in, there's a whole other painting underneath of this painting that I had shown. But anyway, I painted, at some point I decided nobody's ever going to buy this painting, so I decided to paint it. So I basically got a big bucket of white, and I more or less re-gessoed the paint. Although there's little bits of the old painting that show through here and there. I couldn't even tell you where they are anymore. But I started with by painting the landscape. I was just going to make it a really big waterfall. And then after a while, after I did that, I said, I could put figures in this, and it would be like a painter's. So I started, and the first ones I did were this group up in here. These guys were in the original. If you go online, I think if you go online and go to my website, I actually have iterations of it. Because one of the things that's interesting about this painting is the fact that I painted on it for so long, and I showed it in at least 3 different iterations, maybe 4. Every time I would show it, I would work on it more. There's this weird history, if you work on a painting that long and you're not completely repainting it, there's this history in it of, how your ideas are changing as you go along. I mean, most of the landscape back here is painted the way I was painting in, the year 2000. And then, but this figure up here is very much like something I would do right now. And there's in-between things as well. So that's sort of an interesting thing that history is sort of visible. The other thing that I was just sort of fascinated by that idea of painting and evolving a painting over a long period of time. Is any of you guys familiar with Leonard Anderson's idol paintings? They're big figure paintings. If you're not, you should look them up. There's 3 big ones, and he's got a couple smaller. But he worked on them over years and years and years. This is what's underneath it. That was the painting that I did and showed in 1995. So this was the second big body of work I ever done. It was kind of a weird cross between Odd Nerdrum and Max Beck. But anyway, it's obviously underneath the other paintings. So this last bit I want to talk about is I'm going to show you a little bit of some of these things in progress. and talk about working space, literally working space like as a verb. How do you work space in a painting? There's all these ideas that, I think a lot of times we don't think about. They just become either rote or, oh, I have this, and that's what I'm working with. But, the idea of the picture plane, the idea of format and scale, which I think are very important, perspective, focus, physicality, which I guess is about literally the physicality of the painting itself, and then sort of two-dimensional spatial indicators. So I thought because I had a fair number of photographs of business I was working on, I try to photograph them fairly frequently as I work on them, but sometimes a lot gets done in one point, so sometimes it looks like it all got done at once. But anyway, this is what the painting looks like now. And it's not a huge painting. It's 36 inches square, thereabouts. So once again, roughly life size of the picture. Here's how it started out. I mean, it began as me doing more or less just sort of thinking abstractly about the color that I wanted to be in it somehow. So this sort of pale orange and pink in the foreground. Here again, one of the reasons I like having this painting is that it's put together from a bunch of different things, actually. Although, hopefully it looks mostly of a place. It's actually not. Like this piece of drapery with a head on it, well, I did out in the woods down near the University of Delaware, and this piece of rock, which I kind of made look more like it was better too, was from there. This business here was connected to the rocks, these rocks here. So it's almost a stratification. That's one space. This was another space. This back here, this was all completely from another place. And in fact, this is actually just drawing that I was looking at a friend's woodcut. This patterning on this tree trunk came from something along those lines too. And then, the little bird down here, that was actually a dead bird that out front of our house, the electric wires, there's places on them where the birds sit and they get COVID, I guess. And then this, once again, is a little stem leaves that I laid on the painting as I was painting that darker area. But anyway, once again, invented or put into the painting. There you can kind of see sort of the steps as it's going along. And at this point, I'm kind of painting it. The biggest problem I had, I was pretty happy with what was going on in the top, but I was really unhappy with the drapery. And the color you see here, this sort of bluish green, that's what the drapery actually was. So then I started changing the color of it. Oh, maybe it should be this color. And frankly, at this point, I don't remember why I chose that color. It was just different from that. And then I went the other way. I went back to sort of this pinkish purple in the foreground. And in the end, I didn't like that either. In the end, it became this kind of gray that had some of all those other colors coming through it still, to some degree. And convention. It's done looking at the painting and not really looking at the, what I'm painting from. Here's the painting again. And I recently bought, this is on the right, that's a painting by, do you guys know Willie Heeks by chance? An abstract painter. Anyway, that's a painting of his. And what I was surprised as I was looking at it is how much spatially similar they are. They're almost set up in these sort of, extreme foreground, this far background that's just sort of amorphous. I don't know, I thought it was sort of interesting. And even some of the shapes are correspond. This is a painting that I did at a similar time. And this rock here and this rock here are the same rock. This is, seeing it from one way, and this is seeing it from the other side. And then this tree is kind of where it was, and I tried to figure out, well, how do I make it look like that's behind it and in front of it at the same time? So it was, this vaguely playing around with sort of cubist ideas without making what looks like literally cubist painting. This is just me out painting. Maybe I'll show you this one last one and we can stop. So this is the kind of drawing that I'll do out in the field. This is mostly pastel and charcoal. Start out charcoal and then pastel. And this is the painting it came from. This is relevant. The most recent largish landscape painting. Here, I played around in the foreground with some of these, actually using various stuff to put into the paint. It's some of it's styrofoam, which I think sort of came from my son was making styrofoam. He came back and he was using styrofoam that he was finding. So there's all this styrofoam. So I would just sort of grind it up and use it as bits to make it stick out. So there's this physicality that becomes that next layer of working into your space. It's just a couple more. Well, these were some of the drawings I guess from this painting. But once again, you can see the beginnings of some of them are like very drawn. This is what it ended up like. So these are smaller paintings, some of which are done on the spot, and some of which are done from drawings. But they're sort of like the one I'm drawing over here. This is a little bigger, sort of a mid-sized painting. And this one, the thing about this one is some of the marks are smaller. It's almost like it's all kind of drawn in a way. I mean, I was actually mixing paint and putting it into tubes so that I could draw with tubes of different colors. It's another one of those ones where it's the same place. I mean, this almost comes out of a quote by Cezanne too. He's writing to his son and was saying, I go down to the Ark River and everywhere I turn, there's another motif. It's that same creek. That's that painting over there. This is a study that I did on the spot, and then which is about that size. And then this is a large painting that I did from that, and I actually did look at some photographs for this as well. But here again, some of what's on the right-hand bank is kind of embedded. The idea here was to get the color about as lurid as I could get it. And a lot of times that's actually just taking what really is there and just pushing it a lot. It's making, pushing the chroma, as far as you can. So this was a drawing. One of the things that's interesting here is there were 3 separate drawings that are all of the same area, but actually I've inverted kind of the space. In other words, actually it all goes down one side, but rather than have the waterfall go back into space, it actually sort of projects forward in a weird way. They're working on. So they sort of slowly accumulate. There's bits and pieces. Some of this, some of the interesting things that I think I started doing here was I was starting to use like scrapings off the palette, just finding colors that were on the palette, molded and dried. Oftentimes I work with sort of disposable palettes. I use like freezer paper, so you can peel the paint off pretty easily, and then I just glue it on with essentially gel. But then there's also these sorts of drawing that I was actually looking at cloud studies from like Chinese painting. It's like the bigger versions of it. This was just what the studio looked like not too long ago. There's some things that are finished, some things that were in progress. I mean, this was in progress at the time. I hadn't painted that plant in there yet. This I'm still working on. That's pretty close to what it was when I showed it. And this is probably 2019. And this is what's on the wall right now. And this has been up I started this like, I don't know, 4 years ago. And every once in a while, I pull it out and mess with it. But I recently played around with it a little more. I always loved the studio paintings of George Brock's. There was a whole series, I don't know, 8 or 9 of them that he did. And which one is which? So Brock is on the left, mine is on the right. What happened to it recently, in the beginning, I was just kind of looking, I think, too much at the Brock and sort of trying to, I decided I was just going to invent some shapes, sort of like as he does. I mean, essentially, he just invents stuff. It doesn't. So I was just sort of, trying to echo some of those shapes here and there. And some of them even come from other paintings. And then this was actually a head that was actually somebody's head that they had made a plastic cast from. So I sort of used that to try to take this stuff. But this is just, I used to own this sort of goldfish bowl or whatever that I kept brushes and stuff. These are just still like things that if you look back at the old painting, you see them in some of the other paintings as well. So by putting those in, it's starting to be more mine. I'm seeing my way to how it might go. At the same time that's going on, I also have this other painting here, this one with the figure in the studio, which I showed and wasn't completely satisfied with when I showed it, but I showed it anyway. And I brought it back, and now I painted out pretty much everything. There was one of the daises was back here with a bunch of still life stuff on it. And I painted that all out and put this big flower or planter that I have home into it. And I don't know, it's changing the space. I kind of hate it right now too, but that just means I can work on it. So I think that's the last slide.
All right, thank you. All right. There was one question from online, and they noticed that a lot of your teachers back in the day were men, and then they were wondering for a while if there were any female artists that were influences.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Joan Mitchell comes to mind. I had female teachers in undergraduate school in printmaking, and actually, at the time, I did a lot of monotypes. Actually, the body of work that I used as my thesis when I got out was actually inspired by a set of monotypes that I did. There's all sorts of painters that I love. I mean, and I see work all the time, and it's a time right now when actually I'm finding out that some artists that I really like, who just went by their initials back in the day, were women.
Hi, I was wondering, in some of your pieces, you talked about letting the canvas kind of show through a little bit, and I was wondering if that's something that you do pretty regularly in your pieces, and how very light washes or letting it come through, how if you do that often affects the space of your work.
I think that's something that's in almost most of my paintings, I would say. That somewhere you can see the original canvas ground or the palest of sort of wash over it, almost like an imprint to it. But I think in terms, spatially, and some of it, we'll talk much about this, but spatially, there's the illusion of the space, but then there's also literally the space of the paint. There's sort of two different schools. There's the idea that if you're making a painting, there is no in front of, behind. There's only next to. If you have a surface, and each shape comes up against the next shape. But when I paint, and when most people paint, they begin with something and then they put something else over it. So now you're actually creating a literal space, which when you're up close looking at the painting, is usually pretty obvious. Usually for me, thin paint means back, and heavier paint means it comes forward, and then whatever's in between. Does that make sense?
I had a technical question. I was wondering what you draw with. Is it paint or?
It depends. Some of the things that are like the one where I was actually pointing it out in the Blue Nude thing, where it was, Sharpie. And I have no idea whether 200 years from now it's still the shape. But I think the black ones are actually pretty fun and don't fade. But I actually draw all sorts of things. Sometimes I'll draw on a canvas with charcoal. Sometimes I usually don't use pencil because pencil does weird things. It comes up through paint, and I also draw with paint, brushes.
So you talked about the pre-painting and also the layering process. Do you ever consider your paintings to be collage at all, or how do you relate them to that?
I think of them, as I've gone along. Now I think of them as having a collage kind of construction without necessarily being literally collage. That is to say that I'll take a piece from here and a piece from here and put them in the same painting. I mean, the one painting that I pointed out, that literally has collage. But most of the time, there's not a disruptive surface of, this thing collage. I've played around with that on occasions, but I don't know, I keep coming. That's one of those things where, like I say, what's your working space? And I tend to come back to, I want the surface to just be a painting. I don't want it to be a collage, even though the ideas are essentially a collage. I literally make a collage out of kind of what things end up being and then paint from it. The problem is that most of those collage ideas come in the process of working, and I never know what's going to be in it until I've stuck it in there. So I don't know, it would almost be like I would be doing it. I could add that in there, and then I could add that in there. I mean, you guys are going to go see Stanley Lewis. I mean, in some ways, he works in that way, sort of, sometimes, where he'll put something in. I mean, sometimes it's a correction, but sometimes it's like literally it's creating space.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you guys. Thanks for